I would also, first of all, like to express my gratitude for this invitation. It is fantastic to be here and to be able to talk to this audience. A lack of public attention is not what the Catholic Church should currently complain about. Unfortunately, not all that attention is benevolent. And despite the overwhelmingly positive reactions to the personal style and first pronouncements of Pope Francis in the media worldwide, we Catholics have good reasons to remain cautious. We are all familiar with the sudden reversals in popularity many public figures have experienced. Shortly before the resignation of Pope Benedict, there was talk of a very serious crisis of the Church. Some even used the sexual abuse scandals, indications of corruption in the Church, and a widespread feeling of institutional stagnation to claim that the Church is at least approaching its most profound crisis since the Reformation. I don't think this should be taken literally. From my German perspective, other phases in history, like the secularization of 1803, Bismarck's attempts to suppress the Catholic Church in the 1870s, the rule of Nazism and of communism in one part of Germany until 1989, and of course the far-reaching alienation between the Church and the liberal bourgeoisie or the social democratic labor movement in the 19th and 20th centuries deserve the label crises more and make us hesitate to accept exaggerations. Others, from Mexico to China, will refer to their own histories in a similar way. But nevertheless, there can be no doubt that we are in a situation indeed in which a serious new reflection on the Church is needed. This new reflection has to be both theological and social scientific. As you all know, the cooperation of theologians and social scientists has not always been easy. The social sciences are not regularly part of the educational profile of churchmen, and many theologians remain skeptical because they see the social sciences as driven by secularizing views and impulses. In that sense, they may still find plausible the way Leo Tolstoy put it in a satirical piece of 1903. There, we hear a devil in hell boasting of having invented the new discipline of sociology to draw men away from the teachings of Jesus. I quote the devil or Tolstoy, I impress on them that all religious teaching, including the teaching of Jesus, is an error and a superstition, and that they can ascertain how they ought to live from the science I have devised for them, called sociology, which consists in studying how former people lived badly. I think José Casanova's masterful presentation has already demonstrated, against this statement, that sociology can play a fruitful role in the debates of the Church. And I hope that I can add further aspects to this picture without repeating too much from what José has already said. José and I certainly share the enthusiasm for certain documents of the Second Vatican Council concerning the self-understanding of the Church in the contemporary world. But when we refer to these documents today, half a century after the time when they were drafted, we cannot evade answering the question of why the reality of the Church today, to a large extent, differs from what was articulated and promised in these documents. Our enthusiasm for the Council documents may be an expression of our desperation about much of what happened since the Council. And as social scientists, we have to develop an explanation for these discrepancies between the spirit of the Council and the hard realities of the Church or the world in which it finds itself. One possible explanation is that the Council itself failed to translate its vision of the Church into a clear and feasible program of institutional reform. The sociology of organizations teaches us, however, that institutional structures and their inertia easily resist lofty declarations and tend to re-stabilize themselves after phases of turmoil, or even roll back what came up in such an exceptional phase. This explanation receives support from one of the best sociological studies on Vatican II, the book by Melissa Wild, that describes the Council as a process in which unexpectedly a kind of collective effervescence, to speak in sociological language, set in a creative and shared enthusiasm of the assembly, theologically interpreted as the operating of the Holy Spirit. The documents are the products of this process, but the defeated minorities did not necessarily give up their resistance to them after the end of the Council. A more radical explanation, sees the documents themselves not as completely unambiguous. Not only their theological and philosophical vocabulary, also the vision of the Church and the views of the secular world would then themselves have to be clarified today. Given the fact that the Council was indeed a process with unexpected results, it would be surprising if there were no inconsistencies and vague passages in these texts. Moreover, the strong pressure to present new things not as new, but as being in continuity with the tradition of the Church, and to avoid any impression of a rupture with, for example, the highly centralized, hierarchical, and dogmatically anti-modern Church of the 19th century, made it very difficult for the Council to become a guideline for later developments. The empirical fact that there has always been in history an interaction between moral developments and the teachings of the Church, an interaction, not a determination in only one direction, still has to be recognized and respected in the self-understanding of a Church that is willing to learn from the world. For me personally, therefore, a double movement is necessary. We have to be more specific and explicit with regard to the social scientific understanding of the Church and the contemporary world, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have to go back to the characterization of the Church in the early statements of the Christian faith, as we find it, for example, in the Nicene Creed. These early characterizations had 4 dimensions. The Church was declared to be una, sancta, catholica et apostolica. By calling itself one, long before mankind developed a geographically correct knowledge of the globe, so not only long before the debate on globalization began, and a full understanding of the varieties of civilizations and political orders in the world, the Church developed a vision of all human beings brought together in one spirit. As, for example, the German Cardinal Karl Lehmann has written, this unity is not only a vision, but always already a reality when Jesus Christ remains the common point of orientation for all, despite all divisions. Such unity should, however, not be misunderstood as uniformity. On the contrary, pressures toward uniformity will necessarily endanger unity. Sanctity or holiness of the Church does not mean that the Church is an institution that is released from the human condition of sinfulness. And I think this is true not only for all individuals, but also for the institution itself. All members of the clergy, including the Pope, are sinners. And while the Church is or should be an attempt to realize on earth what can never fully be realized here, sacredness remains an inspiration and a normative yardstick, but must not be turned into self-sacralization. Self-sacralization is a constant danger of all human institutions. And the idea of a reason of the Church, in analogy to the raison d'etat, prevents the institution from judging itself by the same high standards it uses with regard to others. Instead of being triumphalist, the Church has to remain humble if it takes its mission seriously. Una sancta catholica et apostolica. The Catholicity of the Church emphasizes its attempt to liberate itself from all cultural and national particularities, although not in the direction of a rational universalism, but in the sense of a deep respect for cultural diversity, coupled with an emphasis on the penetration of all cultures by the Christian message of salvation. A universalism that is not disconnected from the inherent particularity of all culture. That could be a contemporary paraphrase of what Catholic intends to mean. Finally, the apostolic character of the Church, although referring to the apostles of Jesus Christ, is above all a call to continue the mission. It is the counter notion to a self-referential church, the emphasis on a goal outside that lies not in a transcendent dimension alone, but in the human beings of the world. A church that is missionary, non-triumphalist in its self-image and historical views, and aiming at a concrete universalism. That is, in my eyes, the lesson that can be drawn from such a renewed reflection on the early statements of our faith. This then must serve as the normative yardstick for our sociological analysis of the role of the Church in the world and of its institutional structures. Now, very briefly, the crucial term in my analysis of the contemporary situation is the word option. I rely on two great religious thinkers when I make that claim, on Charles Taylor and on William James. The main accomplishment in Charles Taylor's monumental work is to have studied the rise of the so-called secular option, chiefly in the 18th century. Taylor makes clear that the rise of the secular option entails a fundamental shift in the preconditions for faith. Ever since this shift, believers have had to justify their particular faith, such as the Christian, not as a specific confession or with respect to other religions alone, but also as such, as faith per se, vis-à-vis a lack of faith that was initially legitimized as a possibility and then, as I argue with regard to some countries and milieus, even normalized. Of course, the rise of the secular option as such should not be understood as the cause of secularization, but it does establish it as a possibility. In the first instance, then, the optionality of faith arises from the fact that it has, in principle, become possible not to believe. Subsequently, under the conditions of religious pluralism, this optionality has become even stronger. But here we need conceptual distinctions originally introduced by William James in his influential article, The Will to Believe. Options, James said, may be, I quote, of several kinds. They may be living or dead, forced or avoidable, momentous or trivial. And for our purposes, we may call an option a genuine option when it is of the forced, living, and momentous kind. End quote. I restrict myself here to the first element of this definition. And quote James again, a living option is one in which hypotheses are live ones. If I say to you, be a theosophist or a Mohammedan, this is probably a dead option because you don't want to be neither the one nor the other. But if I say, be an agnostic or a Christian, it is otherwise. Trained as you are, each hypothesis makes some appeal, however small, to your belief. This distinction seems to me to be extremely relevant for the understanding of what one may call genuine pluralism. If, as in many European societies, a Muslim minority lives together with a Christian or agnostic majority, where the majority does not feel attracted to Islam, nor the minority to the religious or secular views of the majority, this would then not be genuine pluralism. There were many such cases of a mere coexistence of different faiths in the past. And such a mere coexistence of a plurality of faiths would have to be distinguished from a genuine pluralism in which people of one orientation can indeed at least imagine to be attracted by a competing worldview. The precise extent to which faith has indeed become an option in this sense in different countries or milieus is, of course, an empirical question. But I think it is safe to say that in contemporary Europe, most Christian believers are constantly confronted with the option of a secular worldview, and moreover, that in the traditionally bi-confessional societies of Central Europe, we can observe not only a shrinking of confessional milieus, but also indications of a trans-confessional Christian milieu that is beginning to emerge. Now, I skip over some things about the United States, and perhaps also about the rising significance of optionality in other fields than the religious field. I mean, this applies to friendship, to love, to many other, to the political, or at least political party affiliations and so on as well. So we are living today in a world of options, but this is true in a completely different sense as well. Not only with regard to the great number of options we encounter in the world, but also with regard to the ever more intense process of globalization. Perhaps the most important sociological trend regarding Christianity today is the enormous globalization of Christianity. Serious observers like Philip Jenkins speak of our time not as an age of secularization, but as one of the most intense phases of the expansion of Christianity in history. This expansion partly has demographic reasons, the rapid growth of the population in some Christian countries, but that, as you all know here in this room, is not the whole story. Through migration and a fundamental shift in the geography of power, outside and within the churches, this will rather sooner than later affect Christians in Europe and North America in many ways. Now, all these processes that can be described by historians and sociologists of religion have enormous intellectual implications. One of the first thinkers to realize this was Karl Rahner. In a retrospective article on Vatican II, the great theologian, who had been deeply involved in the drafting of the council documents, already recognized that the council constituted a qualitative leap, as he said, for the Catholic Church on its way to truly becoming a world church. What it has always been in potentia, it is now becoming in actu, he wrote. One of the reasons why the council led to the experience of collective effervescence clearly seems to have been the intensity of the mutual encounter of bishops and theologians from all over the world. Rahner saw this as the beginning, but not more than the beginning, of a totally new phase in the history of the Church, comparable for him only to the radical new creation of St. Paul when he transcended the limitations of a Jewish religious sect and turned Christianity into a magnet for people from the whole Mediterranean world of his time. More than even Rahner might have anticipated, this leads to a new constellation of what I have called genuine pluralism in large parts of the world. Christianity is becoming a living option for people for whom it was either not available before or tainted by the missionary activities of colonial powers. But for the Christians in Asia, the long intellectual and religious traditions of their own civilizations also remain living options. In the words of the Cambridge church historian David Thompson, I quote, "Asian Christians have therefore sought to understand all world faiths as being in some way vehicles of God's self-revelation. In this respect, they ask questions similar to those asked by Western missionaries. Comparisons between Jesus and Krishna or Buddha seem to require abandonment of any Christian claim that God is uniquely revealed in Jesus Christ. This in turn raises the question of whether Christianity was distorted as it was expressed in Hellenic culture. End of this quote. While these questions are not new in the history of theological thinking, they are now posed in non-European contexts in new and challenging ways. The two main new constellations of optionality I have briefly sketched here: the confrontation of the Christian faith with widespread irreligion in Europe and a few other countries, and with Asian and African cultural traditions in other continents, have a striking similarity. They both undermine the fusion of the Christian faith with particular European cultural traditions. I am deeply interested in investigating what this means for a contemporary re-articulation of the Christian faith. All theologies that do not take seriously these challenges seem to me to be obsolete. But I will not go further into this here. I think these changes certainly force us to speak in a new language, not in the linguistic sense, of course, but in ways that are based on distancing oneself from a traditional idiom and permeated with an understanding of other civilizations and of the achievements of secular worldviews. They force us, as the East German Bishop Joachim Wanke once put it, to elementarize the faith, to take the hierarchies of truth in the Christian faith very seriously. Now, as a concluding section, let me devote a few minutes to a short sociological reflection on the church as an institutional structure. In the course of the 19th century, mostly Protestant church historians began to integrate insights from sociology in their research. And around 1900, some of the greatest figures in sociology began to investigate which forms of social organization were created out of the spirit of religious innovation. Max Weber, as most of you know, distinguished between two main types of religious organization in Christianity, the church and the sect. His friend and rival Ernst Röltsch introduced a third form called mysticism or individual spirituality. They did not consider these types as exclusive. When discussing, for example, the Salvation Army, Röltsch clearly was sensitive to further types, the army as a model for a religious organization. There are 4 reasons why these attempts are relevant for the contemporary situation. The first reason is that this typology is not simply an attempt to develop a classification. It's much more ambitious, namely an attempt to study institutions by putting them back into their status nascendi. We should not take the existence of the church for granted, but recognize how improbable its emergence and growth were. The second reason is that these sociologists of religion took the plurality of Christian religious organizations seriously. They did not treat sects or the formation of spiritual communities as aberrations from the path of the only saving church, nor did they, like the sectarian tradition, condemn the church as necessarily corrupt, decadent, authoritarian, or whatever. All these organizations have their own sociological logic. This also implies that they denied, and this is my third reason, a historical teleology in the direction of one of these main types. They do not assume that the church will definitely defeat the stricter organizations based on voluntary memberships, the sects, or the tendencies toward religious individualization. But they see an interplay of these organizations, new developments in one direction, as reactions against developments in the other direction, and individual biographical trajectories leading through different types of Christian religious organization. And fourth reason, Max Weber and in our time, Robert Bellah, open our eyes for the parallels between the emergence of the Christian church and the institutional innovations brought about by other religions based on the innovations of the axial age. All these post-axial age religions have a certain potential for a utopian order that they preserve in special types of institutions. I quote Bellah, relaxed fields within the gentle violence of established social orders, and sometimes the not so gentle violence in times of political turmoil. The Buddhists invented monasticism, the ancient Greeks and Chinese philosophical schools. The dialogue between such a historico-sociological analysis of the church or of the history of Christianity in general with the theological self-interpretation of the church seems to me to be a pressing task in this world of options. This task is all the more pressing since a number of easily available interpretative patterns of the church have lost their plausibility. The church cannot simply become a membership organization, nor should it be imagined as a quasi-state. Charles Taylor has taken up ideas from Henri de Lubac and Yves Congar and spoken of the church as at least potentially a network of agape. I agree that the ethos of love has to be the guiding idea, and that the idea of a network could be attractive as an antidote to the hierarchical centralization of a quasi-state. But perhaps the most fruitful idea so far is the idea of a synthesis of the main types of social organization from the social history of Christianity. We have to preserve the universalism of the church, but integrate into it the pluralism of the voluntary organizations that energizes the sects. And this renewed church ought to be experienced by the individual believers not as an impediment for individual spiritual development, as it unfortunately often is, but as enabling such an individual development. That at least was the perspective of Ernst Troeltsch, with whose characterization, Protestant theologian, with whose characterization of Catholicism, in my rather clumsy translation, I would like to conclude, Catholicism is not the miracle of rigid consistency as which it has often been considered. From its beginning on, it has been an infinitely complicated system, full of contradictions, that has again and again in ever new ways attempted to combine fantastic popular religion and philosophical dogma, revolutionary individualism and absolute authority, profane cultural techniques and otherworldly asceticism, lively laymanship and priestly domination, a masterpiece of mediation that created in church authority only the ultimate regulator for the cases in which these mediations lead to frictions and a lack of clarity. Thank you. Thank you.